My name is Byron Dale. I'm going to basically be talking about where all the corruption comes from and who finances it. We only have government corruption and police corruption and court corruption because it's all run by the same people who never run out of money. I'll just start in the beginning. Years ago, I had a ranch in South Dakota, and I began to wonder how that everybody I knew produced wealth out of the ground when the rain rains and the sun shines and the grass grows and the cattle eat it. And yet everybody I knew had to go to a financial institution of one kind or another and borrow operating money. And I began to wonder just how that worked. I mean, I saw an ad from PCA, Production and Credit Association, a farm lending institution, supposedly owned by the producers, and said this family had borrowed money from 3 generations. Well, after 3 generations of producing wealth, why would you need to borrow money from anybody? So I got curious about it, and I was always trying to learn how to do things better, and I went to a management meeting in Denver, Colorado, put on by Beef Magazine and a managing group that managed operations for farms, and there was about 300 people there. And during the process, I asked the guy, well, if we're all borrowing and all in debt, because we did some financial statements that showed, you know, the operating expenses of some of the people they was working with, and I began to notice that every one of them was getting a little deeper in debt. Now, some of them got more assets than the others, but they all got a little deeper in debt. So I asked the speaker, I said, well, where's all this money come from? And he said, well, it's just funny money, they just print it. I said, okay, I guess that makes sense to me, but if that's the truth, they just print it, and we borrow it and pay interest on it, who gets the interest off the printing press? And he got really red-faced, and he began to mumble, and he said, well, nobody. I said, well, obviously can't be true. If we've all borrowed it and we're all paying interest, and it just came off a printing press, somebody has to get an interest off the printing press. And just like that, he just looked it over the other room and said, what was it that you wanted? And just like that, I disappeared. And on the way out of the room, I got bumped. And I was curious, and I looked over, and there was a nice lady there, and she said, you need to look into the Federal Reserve System. I didn't have a clue what she was talking about, but that's neither here nor there. And so we went home, and we figured out how to run the books and do all the management practices they taught us. It took us about 6 months on our own, my wife and I. And then I began to understand there was really something wrong. So I began to do a lot of, in fact, I had a son that just graduated from high school, and one day I was asking him questions, and he said, Dad, I don't know the answer to any of your questions, but I'll make you a deal. If you promise not to ask me ever any of these questions again, I will run this entire 5,000-acre ranch for 3 months, and you can just do whatever you got to do to figure out what you want to do, because I can tell you really got this on your mind. And I asked him if he was serious, and he said yes. And so I said, son, you just made yourself a deal. So then I went to the house, and I sat in the office. We had a home office, and I called everybody I could think of, and I ordered books by the dozens from the state library. Didn't read them all, but scanned them. And I began to understand, and I would go back and ask them questions, and they'd look it up for me and give me something to read about it. And I began to understand that money is created by banks. So I was sitting there one day talking to my wife, and I asked her, what would happen if we wrote to the Treasury and asked them these questions? And she said, I don't know, let's find out. And I didn't learn to type till I was 49 years old, so she down and typed up the letter, and we have it. And I have a book that's nothing but those letters and the government, the responses from the United States Treasury, the Bureau of Printing and Engraving, the Bureau of the Mint, and the Library of Congress, and all these people. And the questions I asked, well, what is money? Where does it come from? How does it get in circulation, basically? And Russell Monk, the general counsel, wrote me an 8-page letter back and said, well, the actual creation of money always involved an extension of credit by private commercial banks. And so I wrote him back, and I said, well, I think that's probably true from what I understand. But if that is true, where does the money come from to pay the interest? And he wrote back and said, well, that comes from the same place the other money comes from. In other words, you got to go to the bank and borrow that too. Then later, a friend of mine wrote the Treasury, and he got the answer back, and it said from John Yetter from the Treasury that the money that one person pays interest on his loan comes from somebody else's borrowed money. And that's how it all works. We constantly get deeper and deeper in debt, and there's no way to get out of debt. The only way you can get out of debt is shift the debt to somebody else. You can't pay it off because there's not enough money in the system to pay it off. And of course, interest is a cost of doing business, so the more interest you have, even if your interest goes down, but the debt goes up, you still have more interest, so your cost of business goes up. And then the only way you and I can get out of debt, and we can individually, well, I actually met with the Federal Reserve, some of them guys in the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., and the guy told me, I can't think of his name right at this second, said, yeah, some people can get out of debt, but collectively we cannot. And that's the truth. And of course, for you or me to get out of debt, the government or somebody like that has to go in debt, and especially the federal government, because it never pays off its loans, it just rolls them over. And the more debt they have, and the more money we can have to capture when we do business without having personal debt. And so, but of course then they have more taxes, and the state government's deep in debt, all of them, and so therefore they have more taxes to pay their interest. So then the taxes and interest constantly makes the cost of doing business go up, and that's basically what caused inflation. It's not too much money, because if we had too much money, everybody wouldn't be short of money. And I hardly know anybody that isn't short of money. And I've never met but one man in my entire life that thought he had enough. So it's very obvious that we have a real problem. And now when you start really putting a lot of thought in this, when you get to create money out of thin air and loan it to somebody, and at least if at 10% interest, at least 1 out of the 10 has to fail, or the other one can't pay their interest. Okay, so now you get to take the property that you created the money at no cost at all, just punching a computer key. So you get to foreclose and you get to take all the property. So you can't lose, and you had no risk because the money never cost you anything to loan in the first place. You didn't earn it, you didn't work for it, you just simply made it when you went in. And it works like this. When you go in and you borrow from a bank, they ask you to sign a promissory note. When you sign the promissory note, that goes on the books of the bank as an asset to the bank and a liability to you. Then they take and put the same numbers that you borrowed into your checking account as a liability to them and an asset to you, and like that, brand new money created. The problem of it is, there is no way to generate the money to pay the interest unless somebody else goes in debt, and then you can capture some of their money doing business. And I thought this wasn't clearly the American way, so I thought somebody ought to do something about it. Well, I couldn't find anybody, so I decided I'd do something about it. So I did a lot of law, and the law in South Dakota in that time, that's where I had my ranch, said that you could actually pay in goods. So I wrote a promissory note payable in my goods that I raised on the ranch, and I went to a lawyer and asked him if that was a legal negotiable instrument. And he said it was. And I said, are you sure? Are you positive? He said, absolutely, that's a legal negotiable instrument. So then I called the state's attorney and I asked him what was legal tender in the state of South Dakota. And he said, anything that's a legal negotiable instrument is legal tender. So I tendered it. And that's when things kind of went bad. So PCA came out to count my stuff, and I said, well, I don't think so. I think I've already paid you, and I'll show you all the laws to show it. And the PCA guy said, we don't care what the law is. And that was the truest statement I ever heard. And so next thing you know, I was served with a court order to come to court. Went there, and it was locked up, so we knocked on the door, and the judge opened the door, and he said, who are you? And I said, well, we're Mr. and Mrs. Byron Dale. We had an order to show up here. Oh, that's that foreclosure action. No, I'd never heard about a foreclosure action. I had never missed a payment. I was never behind a payment and didn't even owe a payment. I just thought that I would pay them off because I had the goods, and the law clearly stated you could pay in goods. And so they proceeded on, and of course it took a while because I soon learned out I couldn't get any lawyers. I got one, and he agreed to do it if I'd butcher beef and give him the beef, he'd do the lawsuit. Well, then he found out, of course that wasn't cash, so he went to the bank to get a little cash, and for the first time in 20 years, he found out he couldn't get a bank loan. So I didn't have a lawyer the next day. So anyway, so we went, and it took a while, but I kind of got the hang of it. And I finally learned out to call up my own motion, and I had these letters from the treasurer that tells me this, so I read them to the court and showed it to them. And I asked him if 10 guys had 10 went and got 10 poker chips apiece, could they have a good poker game? And he said yes, and the lawyer against me said yes. And I said, okay, so we could have a good game. So now when everybody come out, they'd have to pay me 11 chips at 10% interest. And they all agreed. And and then I said, well, then this is an impossible contract. And the law says any contract that's impossible or repugnant to the nature of the contract is a void and unenforceable contract. And the lawyer, he turned just as white as a sheet, and the judge got just red as a beet. It almost looked like all the blood ran out of the lawyer and onto the floor and back up into the judge's face. I mean, that's how bad it really was. And that's when they started having hearings without notifying me. And the next thing I knew, I had 42 cops show up at my house. And actually, they called me and said they'd like to have a meeting because I talked to the Attorney General and tried to contact the governor, and I done all these things trying to, you know, talk about this and get some. And they said, well, we've finally agreed, the Attorney General agreed to give you a hearing. And so in Mobridge, who was the town close to the ranch, and so I was there and stayed overnight. And where we stayed, my wife had a house there too, because the son was going to school there, high school. And the phone rang about, I don't know, 5 o'clock in the morning or something like that. And she got up and answered it, and I heard her say, why, who wants to know? And then the next thing I knew, she said, Byron, they're going to do it to you. And I said, what are you talking about? Well, they're going to do it to you. That guy just called from Selby, a town 18 miles east of there, and said 15 carloads of highway patrolmen just drove up and filled up with gas, and we was talking about this, and we couldn't decide where they'd be going, and we decided the only place that many patrolmen would go would be Mr. Dale's place. Well, now this is a civil action. It had nothing to do with the government or cops or anything else. And so I said, honey, this is America. Things like that don't happen in America. I haven't broken any laws. I haven't done a single thing. She says, I'm telling you, you're going to be in chains before the day is over. So we talked it over and decided what to do. And I decided, well, together we decided the safest thing was just go to the ranch and start calling reporters, because I had a lot of contact with reporters over this. And in fact, just a year or two ago, I ran into a lady from New Hampshire, and she remembered hearing all about it at that time in New Hampshire. In fact, we even had a TV crew fly all the way from Chicago to interview us in Timber Lake, South Dakota, which just about in the middle of no places you can get. And so, you know, it made a lot of press, but it didn't make any difference. And so then they had ex parte hearings, and then the next thing I knew, they had an order for the receiver to take my property, but the receiver wasn't there. So we were sitting there in the house and discussing this, and back and forth, and then they said, well, if you would, you know, would you go into PCA's office? I said, no, I've been in there enough. They can come out and see me now if they want to see me. And so then the guy said, well, could we take some of it? And I said, well, yeah, I'd be willing. I'll let you have half, and I'll keep half. But the deal is, we have to now have a real meeting with the governor and attorney general and really discuss this whole issue. And later in the trial, he said that I was shocked at that. I expected him to get mad, and I didn't know what to do. So then I turned to the guy that they had sent out with me, who was a black belt in karate and a two-term veteran in Vietnam, and nightstick instructor for the police, and they'd sent him out there. And actually later I learned in his own testimony they'd sent him out there to take me out. And he'd been out working all day, and he got home at noon or midnight. They called him in and wanted him to come back in. He said, I ain't going to do that. I just got off work. I'm tired. No, you're coming in. We're going to do that to Mr. Dale, and we want you there. And so he was there, and they called him in. After they was there a while, they called him into the PCA office, and they asked him if he could take Mr. Dale out. And he said, what do you mean take him out? Well, you know, take him out so we can take his stuff. And, well, you know, and he said, well, yeah, I suppose they can do that. If he's standing up unarmed, he's simply sitting down armed, it'll be harder, but yeah, I think I can do it. Well, will you do it? Yeah. So he testified that's all he did the rest of the time while we was talking there after we come in, because they drove in and knocked the door, and I was actually talking to a reporter on the phone who'd called me, because once I called the reporter that morning, then they called each other, and pretty quickly it was, you know, I was getting called just all over from reporters. And so he said he was shocked at that, so he said, when next time the phone rang and I got up to answer it so it quit ringing, he said, can you take him when he sits down? He said, yeah, I think so. And he said he'd thought about first hit me with his fist and then kicking me with his, swinging his table over the top, his leg over the top and kick me. But he didn't know, and he was afraid to hit me because I talked with my hands and he might block it. So then I was getting close, and I was going to roundhouse kick him, and then but he had a radio on the table, so I had to move that a little bit, and that's when I noticed the ketchup bottle for the first time, and then I knew what I was going to do. So when I sat back down, the one guy got my attention like this, and And the other cop, who had moved himself a little bit closer, jumped up and grabbed the ketchup bottle and hit me over the head. And I have the scar there, and I've got the pictures to prove all this. And I still happen to have the ketchup bottle with it, just putting it full of ketchup. It did not break, but my skull opened up and bled all over. So then I remember coming out of my chair and hitting the wall, and went in, and then the next thing I knew, he was on me, and I don't remember for a few seconds what happened. The next thing, I was on my porch, and he had his chest on my back and his arms under my stomach trying to throw me down. I wasn't quite so heavy then and a little more active. And so I looked up and all I saw was his crotch area, so I grabbed the Holt and he turned loose. And then the other guy come in, he was about a guy your size, and he hit me like a fullback coming in for a big block, and down I went, and I just unfortunately wasn't strong enough to throw that much weight off. And then the other guy jumped on and started hitting me in the head, so I reach up, and when I was younger, had pretty good flexibility in my legs, so I'd reach up and kick him off of me with my foot, and he claimed I about knocked him out, which I don't think was probably true, but anyways, he couldn't do that, so he come around behind me, and then he beat me on the side of the face until my face was so swollen. When my mother and my wife saw me the next day at the hospital, they both said they would not have recognized me if they hadn't knew who I was. And they had a meeting later in the trial, I found out, and they charged me resisting an officer and resistance of process of service. But in the trial, they admitted that I hadn't done 90 to 1, and that he was the aggressor, and the cop himself testified that hit me, said that he was the aggressor, and the lawyer said, well, you hit Mr. Dale first? And he said, oh yeah. Well, was he surprised? He said, yeah, Mr. Dale never expected a thing. And so then they went in the jury room, and the jury sent back a thing to the judge and said, well, what exactly are we supposed to find Mr. Dale guilty of? And then so the jury found me, they went 10-2, voted that I was not guilty. But the one guy that worked for the state that was on the jury gave him so much heck, and I don't know what all happened there, but 6 hours later, they found me guilty so they could go home. So when they come in and they all found me guilty, and 2 of the jurors left the courtroom in tears, and the judge was shocked. And so it was all a put-up deal, because the state legislators already had a meeting, decided how much they was going to have to pay me in damages for what they'd done. For first thing, in South Dakota at that time, you couldn't serve a legal process and live in the county, and neither one of the highway patrolmen that was there lived in the county, so the whole thing was illegal. And I got a young lady lawyer out of Minneapolis that I met through some other people, and she actually sued him in federal court for excessive force. And they again admitted that they committed excessive force and everything. And we caught them, we proved that they lied and falsified the evidence, because one reporter taped me twice during the day, and he recorded them both. And before the trial and on excessive force in federal court, they took and went in and spliced them to make it sound like I'd said something in a way that I'd never said it, period. And the reporter got up and testified to that, and the jury got beat red. So the judge, he said, oh, it's about time for lunch. We better break for lunch. So we had lunch, and we come back in, and he said, has the defense got any motions they want to make before we continue, before they bring the jury back in? And they said, yes, we want to make a motion for dismissal because he's failed to prove his case. And the judge says, agreed and granted, and that was the case. One of the jurors even went on TV that night and said that obviously they never intended us to let us make a decision in this case from the very beginning. So it went all the way, and then I did several other things to try to address this issue, and it always ended up the same way. They put me in jail for something that wasn't a crime. We went to a farm auction one time and bought some property and paid for it the same way. And the banker on that stand testified that everything I'd done was legal. I formed a trust to give me the right to do all this, just like PCA and Federal Land Bank had. That I had just exactly the same lawful authority to do that, create money as they did. Only I wasn't creating money, I was just trying to monetize my production. And they said everything he did was legal, but it's a crime. And then they also said if we don't stop Mr. Dale now, he will in time destroy the entire banking system. And when I appealed it to the South Dakota Supreme Court, the court ruled that you can't do that. That's absolutely wrong. If it was anybody but Mr. Dale, we would throw the case out. But being as it's Mr. Dale, we're going to let it stand, but don't you ever try anything like that again. And it just went on. And I mean, they make up laws as they go to put you in jail if they got to stop you. And it don't make any difference where you go. I got a little traffic ticket one time. It was no big deal. But we went there and we challenged it, and we proved that you know, the radar wasn't right. For example, the guy, I said, well, how did you think I was speeding? He said, well, I got you on my radar. I said, well, I don't understand how that worked. I said, I've subpoenaed your radar gun information, and it's already been broke down 3 or 4 times this year. What made you think it was working when you got me? And he said, well, you was the first one in the morning. And I said, well, how did it go? And he said, well, I got to work and the car was standing still. And I asked him if the car was standing still in the parking lot. He said yes. And he got again, and I said, you sat still in the seat? And he said yes. And the radar gun was sitting still on your dash, and he said yes. And then you picked up your tuning fork and you snapped it, and it said it was doing 60 miles an hour. And he said, that's right. And I said, well, you was holding the tuning fork still in your hand when you hit it? And he said, yes. I said, how could anything be going 65 miles an hour? You just testified everything was standing still. And so I said, isn't it true that all you did is check the vibration? So if anything on my car or near my car would have been vibrating just right, you would have got that reading. And he said, yes. So then they dropped the fine down. I don't know how much it was anymore, but it come down to finally $15 when they got all through. So I said, okay, now you're fining me $15. Is that true? And he said, yes. I said, okay, if you can tell me what a dollar is, I'll pay. And he couldn't. So then first thing you know, they had cops up there, and they was going to arrest me and haul me off. And I said, well, I just, you know, I know hay and silage and corn and barley and cattle aren't money, because I've tried all them, and the courts ruled they're not money. In fact, the court in the South Dakota Supreme Court ruled that you can't make payment with cows, but they can beat you up and take payment for, you know, the cows for payment on a mortgage. Now, I never could figure that out either, but you're dealing with a total corrupt system that's all corrupt because of the monetary system's corrupt. And when you have a corrupt debt-based money system that allows the banks to create all the money they want, to make anybody they want a loan, and demand interest on it, which can't be paid without forcing somebody else to borrow some more money, you have an entity that absolutely has the keys to the world kingdom. And we know they have it because now all the countries in the world are dead, aren't they? Clear up their eyeballs. And they get entire ownership. And I watched them in the 80s. They planned, in South Dakota, they had a law that said you couldn't charge over 6 or 8% interest. And then I remember it well on the radio saying, we've got to change this law because the capital in this state's going to dry up. So they got the law changed, and that's when right away after that you had 18 to 22% interest. So it was all planned in advance to take the land away from the people. And I have a friend in the night of South Dakota who lived there all his life. And years ago, we drove around, and that's how we met when we went to the private high school together. And he showed me where all these families had lived at that time. And now, there are just a few guys that own and operate between 100 and 50,000 acres, every one of them. And I could go on all night. And, pardon me. And you don't need to have me go on all night. I have done this in several states, and they're all the same. Every judge in America is crooked as a snake can get. They all do the same thing. They bow down to the bankers. They ask the bankers. They go to the governor when they have problems and can't get something enforced. And I was just not doing anything but making a lot of press and resisting. And like I said, I got pretty good at this resisting and how to call up my own motions and do this stuff. And when they got through, it cost him more money than it would have just given me the ranch in the first place, quite a lot more. So, but it doesn't really make any difference. You can go any place you want in this country and you'll find the same thing. The judges are corrupt. Nobody will address the money issue. Nobody will address the corruption of it. And you hear these people talk about fiat money, which is silly. Our money that we use is not fiat because it's never been declared by any government to be money. Our money is absolutely just accepted and used because people have been bamboozled into believing that's what it is. You can ask anybody, any place, what we use for money, and they won't have a clue. If you get right down to it, and you ask Erlon, who's done a lot of it too, they don't have a clue what we use for money. Yet they're all wanting to use it, and everybody I know wants more of it.
Except one person. Who is that person?
I don't
remember. You said earlier you only never met one person who thought he had enough money.
Well, I sold gold for a while, and I called the guy one day, and he said, "No, I'm an old man, and I don't want any more money. I don't want anything. I got more than will last me all my lifetime," and he's the only one I've ever met. But Bill Gates and all these guys, Rockefellers and all these guys that own the world, they seem to always want more and more and more. So this whole thing about too much money is nonsense. In fact, I can never had anybody in my life be able to give me a logical reason why an increase in the money supply would make price inflation. But increase in interest will sure make price inflation because your cost of business goes up. And if you don't raise your prices to keep up with your cost of business increases, you will go out of business. And it's that simple. They own the world, they run the world, they own the Congress. You just think about that. You're a congressman and I'm a banker. You got to have a lot of money all the time to run for office, don't you? Every 2 to 4 years, 6 years, right? I can create all the money I want. In fact, I read an article one time that when one of the Kennedy boys was running, they did a little money. They took one picture, a little picture, and mortgaged it for lots of money. And that's how they got the campaign. I had a state legislator in Minnesota tell me all the Republicans get their money from the bankers. And you try to do something about the banking, well, I can't do that because I won't be able to run again. I mean, this is how much power they have. This is where all this power comes from, and this is where all the corruption comes from, in the courts and everything else. Then you add a lot of just greed, and you know, nothing beats greed. And the last judge I had in one case, he just got a brand new car out of no place, all of a sudden, just before my case come up. Now, isn't that a nice little deal? And my wife one time, after they beat me up, I wasn't feeling well enough. I was in the hospital for 8 days, and this eye was still bleeding for 2 weeks after. And I can show you, I mean, I was just swollen all over from the beating and from where they hit me in the head. That's a bottle, and that was a cut about like that. And I can show you all the pictures. I can verify everything I got. I got all the letters to prove everything I said is true. That's what they told me how it works. So I really, you know, we can go on forever. I see no reason to waste everybody's time. But this is what it's really all about. If people really want to change things, they've got to take the power of creation money away from the banks and give it back to the people. And you can do it on a state level, or you can do it on a federal level, just whichever one you want to do. But it's going to take a lot of people to get together and do it, because they won't do it for one individual or two, because I've tried it in Minnesota for 17 years now. I have a bill in the Minnesota legislature, have had for most of the last 17 years, that shows you exactly how they, by state law, would have the state banks, state chartered banks, create money as a payment to rebuild the infrastructure and put debt-free money in circulation in a way that benefits everybody, because they'll only spend it on things that you have to have, like transportation, and you cannot have commerce without transportation. You can have commerce without money, because you could trade, but if you can't get the product back and forth, you cannot have commerce. And I thank you for your time, and I wish you good luck.
It's a wrap. You were pushed into buying patented seeds? Because I know that that's a big thing that's been
because I had basically a ranch.
Oh, because I know in farms that produce a lot of food that they then send to grocery stores or Super Value or wherever, it's just a handful of large companies that own the DNA for seeds.
Yeah, but that wasn't that much 30 years ago. And this happened about 30 years ago.
I think that's a pretty recent thing. But I just
Well, and it's happened since then. It gets worse every day. It will get worse every day till we change it.
And just the fact that you can't even grow your own seeds.
Well, that wasn't the problem there.
Right.
We did grow
I don't
on
mean
feed,
that.
and
We saw the movie Food.
Yes.
most of my operation, well, we started out when I was 22. I got married to a kind of a cute little dark-haired girl. And we went to work, and I got a section of land from my dad on a contract for deed. And we had a section of land we leased. And I owed partner 185 or 90% on it when I got it. And 18 years later, we had a 5,000 acre ranch, about 2,500 acres deeded, 2,500 acre leased, and was worth $1 million on paper. And I noticed it was really easy to get in debt, but pretty tough to get out of debt. And I noticed too, about the time people really begin to start doing good, then they'd have all a big price drop, and it really hurts you. And then you could start all over again, you know. And I went through a couple of 3 of them. And 1 3-year period, we made about $160,000 above all expenses, and I ended up deeper in debt than I was when I started. And I said, now how is that possible? How can you have a clear profit above all expenses and everything, interest and everything else, $160,000 in 3 years, and end up deeper in debt when you started? Well, I figured out how that worked after a while too. But You know, and this is the things that led me into really getting into this and just how does it work. And I seem to have the ability to read something and know which is BS and which is truth. And you get a lot of both when you write to your legislators and your congressmen and to Treasury. I mean, Russell Monk told me all this, and he said, but it's a really good deal because it allows the bankers to give aggressive young men, you know, the means to go out and produce more. Yeah, that they get going all the time.
Well, every time, you know, you ask yourself this question. All the politicians and, you know, oh, we've got a crisis, Main Street's not lending. Ask yourself this, why does everybody need credit? Why do we have to have lending? Or businesses, but why, isn't there any money ordinarily?
No, there is no money unless you borrow.
That's the answer, but ask yourself that question. Well, what does everybody need credit for? What is this all about? Bill, I think you should ask him if you would, ask him about the books he has and his website. Can you do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you need to tell about the books you've written and then your website address and how people can get more information if they're interested.
Take it away.
You on camera?
Absolutely, we're rolling.
Your question was if I've ever written any books or done anything like that, and the answer is yes. I've written 4 books, starting with Bash by the Bankers, which is this story I just told you about, and then there's another one, Down on the Farm, that goes through all this and shows how the monetary system, particularly how its effect on agriculture. And then there's the Tales from the Treasury, which is nothing but a compilation of the letters I wrote to the Treasury and their answers to me. So you can go get the answers. And I give you all, in the book is the exact copy of what I wrote and what they wrote back to me. You can decide whether I, you know, falsified it or whether I didn't tell it the way it worked, or not. But that's exactly what they told me. And then the last book is Modern Money Secrets. It goes through all of this. It's a much bigger book. Published a little better. All the books have been self-published because you can't find anybody to publish these kind of books. They won't go out. And stores won't handle them either. I've had stores take them and pretty quickly. They don't want nothing to do with them, and they don't want you in there anymore. And we have a website called wealthmoney.org. And there you can see, and also there's a YouTube, Byron Dale YouTube, where you can see a lot of speeches I've given and things like that. And then articles we've written on the website there too. I love to take the Mises writing and show them how nonsensical it is and how wrong it is, because it's so easy to prove they're wrong. They're the biggest government or banking agency out there. They get everybody believing they're against them, and they're absolutely just trying to make sure that people always shift the blame to the government and never to the banking system. And as I said before, it's so clear, if I have the money and you need money to run, who do you think controls who? You don't control me, I control you. And that's the way it works. And they control it all. And if you don't stop that, you will never stop any of the rest of this, period. And it's been that way since Hamilton did it, and that's the first thing they did was put a tax on after Washington made Hamilton Secretary of Treasury. He got a tax on, and then after that he created a central bank so they could create the money as debt. And it's been that way ever since. Hamilton was absolutely a banker's man and in there for the express purpose of making sure the bankers got control. And it's been that way every year. And of course, the longer it goes, in fact, there's a chart on my website and you'll see it. We worked it out and I sent it to the Federal Reserve in Minneapolis and they confirmed its accuracy. By 2016, the debt will be so large at just 6% interest. The interest alone will be $5 billion greater than the total consumer income of everyone in America. Now tell me where it's going to go from there. I don't predict the future. I don't try to tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. I just tell you what happens in the past, and it's a lot easier to go back and read history and see what's happened than it is to predict what's going to happen tomorrow. Well, they're not going to let it happen that way. What they're going to do is just keep slowly bringing the standard of living down and down, but not too quick. It's just like, you know, you've heard about putting the frog in cold water, and you just turn up the heat a little bit, and you just get him a little bit warmer, and his body adjusts because that's what his body does. It's not like ours. They don't have a set temperature, and it gets warmer and warmer. First thing you know, he's cooked and don't know it. And that's what they're going to do to us. And you'll see slowly They're taking away the rights to own property all the time. That's all this housing bubble's away. And I even heard him talking the other day on some people where some of these banks are now thinking, well, we won't sell these houses. We'll just put them out and let people rent them. In fact, we'll rent them back to a lot of the guys that's losing them. It's the same old thing, just like the ranch, and they took all the farm away from it. Years ago, a lawyer by the name of Larry Beecraft sent me a letter he got from a reporter that openly said by the president of the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, I think, that we believe that we only need about 100,000 farmers in America. So they went to work to see that there wasn't any more than that. And of course, you don't very of them when they each want to have a 100,000 acre farm. Now, I guarantee you 100,000 acres is a lot of acres. That's a lot of land. And of course, you can do that with big four-wheel drive tractors. You can do a section in 2 or 3 hours, or a quarter in 2 or 3 hours. I mean, it's so easy to see the planning that's went into all this if you just sit down and really take a look. And all the other things, but see what they've done and what so many people do, they try to get everybody fighting about everything except what the real problem is. You will not solve anything by cutting off leaves out of a tree. You have to cut the roots out. And the root of all this is greed of the bankers and other people, and the control the bankers have of the money, and only let it into the system as interest-bearing debt owed to them. You cannot beat that kind of a system, because there's nothing that'll beat. Interest is the only thing that'll run 24/7 and never have to be oiled, greased, or shut down for repairs. Nothing else can do that. No human, no animal, no machine. But interest can do that. It never has to stop for anything. It just runs. And you can't beat that, and you can't beat the power that gives the people who have that power. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope I didn't bore anybody.
No.